Thanks so much, folks, for joining us here today. My name is Jonathan Martin. I write a column for Politico, and I'm thrilled to have this conversation today with a distinguished guest, somebody who is no stranger to Aspen, somebody who is no stranger to this country, Kevin Rudd, the ambassador from Australia to the U.S., and also the former Prime Minister of Australia. And I was thinking about what we were talking about today, and I was a little bit worried because we're in such boring times, Mr. Ambassador, and there's just such little going on. But we'll try to find something to discuss here for the next few minutes.
Well,
do you think we can?
The so-called Great Confucian curse, as you know, is may you live in interesting times. And I personally prefer boring times. but we haven't been allocated that from the heavens.
Well, you are representing your government at an extraordinary moment in Washington, and certainly this moment in America. We're going to talk today chiefly about Ambassador Rudd's expertise, which is the Pacific, especially Australia and China. But let's just do a bit of a around the world here to start, beginning with the events of the last week in the Middle East. Tell me what your view is, looking ahead, on what is the best case scenario for Iran and for the broader region. There's now a ceasefire in place between Israel and Iran. What's the best case scenario, do you think, in the midterm and in the longer term in the region?
Well, I'm a China guy by background, so China is what I know about. I've been working on it for 50 years. The Middle East is not my patch, so this has all the caveats of a rank amateur and not representing the official views of the Australian government. So
that aside,
here we go.
He's very modest.
No. The beginning of wisdom in this business is to know what you don't know, quite apart from what you do know. Number one, we all want the ceasefire to hold.
Yes.
And frankly, full marks to the president for having the chutzpah to put it on the line.
It's an Australian word, isn't it?
Chutzpah is an ancient Australian expression. Begins with the letter F. The chutzpah. So look, we Australians are not going to criticise any head of state for using colourful language. I've used a lot of it myself over the years, and some of it on video. So number one, achieving a ceasefire between the two most unlikely states to agree to a ceasefire, notwithstanding the circumstances. But secondly, several days in, through what he has said, what he has engaged with them on, to cause them to conclude it's in their interest to do so.
Yeah.
So that's point number one. Point number two, to use the interim to finally bring the Iranians to the negotiating table in terms of accepting a set of arrangements with the US and the rest of the international community on what is left of the Iranian nuclear weapons program. That's the second point. And the third is, and again, to be supportive of what President Trump is seeking to do with Gaza and the West Bank, to move the debate and the dial in the direction of a sustainable two-state solution.
Does this do that?
In terms of dealing with a core Israeli national security concern, which is a long-standing concern, going back to my time in political office in Australia, as Prime Minister, as Foreign Minister, and before that, which is the Iranian program. The fact that this progress has been achieved in the retardation of the program meets a core Israeli national interest, national security interest, and therefore would hopefully provide an opening for the United States and the rest of the international community to cause Israel to conclude that a two-state outcome is the best for Israel, best for the Palestinian people, best for the US, best for US allies, including my own country, and best for the rest of the world, because there does need to be a Palestinian homeland. When we, as Australia, put our hand up first in the UN General Assembly in 1947-48 to vote for the establishment of the State of Israel, we were the first yes vote.
I didn't realize that.
It's alphabetic, A. And but there's only 50 nation states in those days. Okay, so it had to achieve a significant majority. So we unapologetically stuck up our hand. And one of my forebears as Labor Foreign Minister had presided over the Palestine Commission of the United Nations in 47-48 because he was seen as outside the circle of the immediate set of interests.
Yeah.
A good international lawyer. The covenant that we compacted on as an international community back then in 47-48 to establish Israel, given the horrendous history of the Holocaust and everything, was simultaneously also to establish a permanent Palestinian homeland, then called Transjordania. That was always the two elements of what in international law we agreed on from the get-go. So if President Trump can push in this direction to get the Israeli government, notwithstanding Bibi Netanyahu's reservations across that line, and assuming there is a reform program within the Palestinian Authority, which has been notoriously badly administered, then I think there is an opportunity to secure the future.
And between a ceasefire between the Iranians and the Israelis, perhaps doing grave damage to the Iranian nuclear program and potentially ushering in some kind of a peace deal with the Palestinians and the Israelis, that could be quite the resume for President Trump's application to Oslo for the Nobel Peace Prize, right?
My first diplomatic posting back in the Mesolithic period, when I first joined the Australian Foreign Service, there were still dinosaurs across the earth back then, stomping around. Was Scandinavia.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of work in Norway. I was a very mature and experienced diplomat, third secretary, the guy who did the photocopying in the Australian Embassy. What I know from that day to this day forward is that the Nobel Committee in Oslo of the Norwegian Parliament fiercely guards its independence. And so anyone who seeks to lobby is going to achieve the reverse effect, knowing how the Norgs are constructed. But in being fiercely independent and having therefore through their own country being party to the Oslo process, which of course is now more than 20 years ago, which for the first time brought Palestinians and Israelis around the table way back when, 20 years ago. I'm sure our Norwegian friends will be very mindful of a real outcome in this area. But as I said, always be mindful of the independence of Scandinavian politicians.
All right, memo to Trump's allies in Congress, don't lobby the Norwegians, they're not going to...
I did not say, I didn't provide any advice.
I did, okay, that's fine. Let's talk about the other major news.
I'm just a humble diplomat to do my job.
The other major news this week, perhaps at once also would have been unlikely, and that is the NATO summit in The Hague. A number of European governments agreeing, Mr. Ambassador, to significantly increase their defense spending. Do you think that you'd see the day when those European governments would be spending 3 or even 4% of GDP on defense? And what do you think prompted that? How much of that is Trump? How much of that's Putin's aggression?
Life in foreign policy and national security policy is usually a cocktail of factors. Number one, you've got, frankly, the fundamental threat which Putin represents to the future strategic stability of Europe. It's not just his first attempt at Ukraine, it's his second, remember, going back to what happened in 2014. Secondly, you have repeated threats against now NATO members who are the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, as well as other threats to Poland. You look at the pattern of behaviour by Soviet naval and air assets around the North Sea, in and around the United Kingdom. So therefore, that provides the strategic surround sound for what has occurred. The threat environment has demonstrably changed in the last decade. Secondly, but again, to give President Trump his due, he has always said that he does not accept the proposition that any US ally should be freeloading on the United States. And therefore, he was consistent about that in the first term. We've seen multiple statements from various European governments in the period since then. But he, together with, I think, strong support from Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom, Secretary General Rutte of NATO, formerly PM of the Netherlands, who we met with our Prime Minister just last week at the G7. They very much backed in the President's message. So what is the core of it? It is a commitment to raise your core defence expenditure from where it is to something in the order of 3.5 by 2035, and an additional 1.5 in terms of, shall we say, surrounding defence outlays, which is supporting infrastructure.
Right.
So against when you've had various European states hovering around, 1 or less,
Right.
To give the President his due, this has been pressure successfully applied, but on the back of an underlying assessment of how
Putin looms.
threatening the Russian military presence remains.
Tell me about the G7. You were in...
There's 7 of them.
There you go. Obviously took math down in Canberra. Tell me about the G7 last week. You were there in the Rockies.
Just up there.
Just straight north, yeah. Trump was there for a day. He obviously left to go back early. But what were your takeaways from that session?
Well, the President cut his time short in Kananaskis.
That's right. Yeah.
Have I got the pronunciation?
Call it Calgary if you want.
Yeah. Alberta.
There you go.
Kananaskis, there you go. It was the venue just outside of Calgary for the leaders' retreat. In cutting it short, a number of bilaterals with a whole list of heads of government did not occur, including our own, but Prime Minister Modi, incoming President of Korea and others. But when it was communicated clearly to the heads of government that this was about making some core decisions about what the United States would do through the National Security Council on the question of Iran, particularly whether to use US ordnance and to deliver it in the manner in which it then was done, everyone got it. This is fundamental, it is essential, and frankly, those bilaterals can be deferred. So there's no, anxiety on the liver about any of that. In terms of the overall mood in the G7, to the extent that I could discern that, obviously there are continuing and rolling bilateral trade negotiations with practically each of the G7 countries, and what I call the outreach countries, those of us who are not formally members of the E7, but are reasonably regularly invited to these gatherings, including Australia, Republic of Korea and others. So, and that is a rolling work in progress, and our Prime Minister spent a lot of time with Secretary of Treasury Bessent, Director of the National Economic Council, Hassett, as well as USTR, Jamieson Greer. So these all represent, points of progress along the road. But it was obviously dominated by the predominant security challenges in the Middle East and Iran, and as we know, these were fundamental events in the course of the last week.
Let's shift to the Pacific. But
I'm glad of that. I know something about the Pacific.
But also, let's sort of keep this focused on the sort of geopolitics of the moment. Is Beijing more likely to invade Taiwan at some point if Ukraine falls to Russia? If there's some kind of the Zelensky government falls, or there's a sort of peace deal in which Russia basically has its way with Ukraine, would that embolden Beijing, do you think, vis-a-vis Taiwan? Are those linked?
I've, as you know, been a scholar of China for the better part of half a century now, since I was a kid at university, and more recently a study of Xi Jinping. And I've published recently on Xi Jinping's ideological framework. Not a book I'd recommend to any of you because it's a very dense read.
But it's available on Amazon right now if you want to.
Yeah, I say...
RUDD is the last name.
I say in the introduction, this is a hard read because it seeks to go to the Chinese primary sources. I'm a Chinese linguist. In terms
That's a real hook, Kevin, to get it meant a hard read.
No, it is a real hard read. But it is about what's his ideological bearings. By looking at the internal Chinese language literature and how the party communicates to itself about its strategic priorities. That's why I did the work. Took 5 years of research and writing. So I feel reasonably comfortable talking about his strategic priorities.
Yes.
And if we were sitting in Zhongnanhai at the moment, which is the Chinese Kremlin, with the Standing Committee of the Politburo, all 7 of them, and members of the Central Military Commission. And the question was, what are our priorities now and into the immediate future? It's kind of in this order. 1, keep the party in power and stay in power yourself.
Right.
Number 2, continue the campaign for the reunification of the motherland, Taiwan, as they define it, which is the Taiwan agenda, but it also goes to China's domestic policies towards Xinjiang, Qinghai, Tibet and Inner Mongolia, as well as what they're doing in Hong Kong. That's number 2 in their list of priorities. Number 3 is continue to grow the economy and to outpace the United States in the global race for AI supremacy. There are a series of priorities which flow below that as well. But in my study of the system, that constitutes their top 3. Taiwan is in that top 3.
Yes.
So what therefore materially affects Xi Jinping's decision-making process? We should be under no illusion as friends, partners and allies of the United States that Xi Jinping wants Taiwan. And he's prepared to use military force to do it if he cannot achieve it by diplomatic or political means. And that is quite clear in their internal literature. So it becomes a question of what therefore causes him to conclude that that could be a problem if he went forward to do it militarily. This brings us back to 1, deterrence. Is deterrence, military deterrence, effective? Where the number 1 building block of deterrence is the power and capabilities of the United States military through Indo-Pacific Command led by Admiral Paparo. This is a complex piece of military geometry which is fought out day by day beyond people's public visibility, and it's China making a calculus about whether the risks of defeat would be too great in order to succeed in that mission. That's the primary determinant.
Yeah.
A secondary one is observing patterns of United States global strategic behavior, which brings in the Ukraine question.
Yes.
And therefore the Chinese do pay attention to US decision-making processes as it relates to other theatres. What they will note is that the President of the United States hasn't simply backed the Putin position. It's infinitely more complex than that in Ukraine if you look at the events of the last 5 months. In fact, President Trump's position from time to time has been quite explosive towards Putin. Secondly, if you look at the Middle East and you look at the decision to deploy massive weaponry in a militarily well-executed operation, then this also demonstrates to others in the Indo-Pacific, including China, that the United States has the capacity and the political will to act.
Yeah, what do you think that conversation was like Saturday night, I guess Sunday morning for them, when the B-2s dropped their payload over Iran?
Even in
the Politburo, yeah. What was that conversation like?
How do I paraphrase that, given that I haven't been sent the notes of the meeting, and I'm unlikely to be sent the notes of the meeting? It'll be along the lines of, they did that. And then because the Central Military Commission generals are close to those discussions, it would be once again them saying US conventional military capabilities are formidable in terms of their global reach and the capacity of the United States to act when it chooses to act. But as I said, that's a set of almost subjective interpretations.
Sure.
The primary determinant in terms of Xi Jinping's timetable on Taiwan is on the essential geometry of military deterrence, where the United States is the core part of the equation. Taiwanese national defence capabilities for the island are the second part of the equation, and the posture of friends, partners and allies in the Indo-Pacific are also part of that equation.
This didn't get a lot of attention in the US, but I believe it was significant for your country. There's something called AUKUS, which is the submarine agreement that was negotiated during the Biden administration between Australia, the UK, and the US, which is a significant agreement in which there has been reporting that the Pentagon, this Pentagon, would undergo a review of that agreement. Al, that was the case at least until President Trump was asked about AUKUS at the G7, in which he was standing there with Keir Starmer and appeared to say that he was still fully supportive of AUKUS. Were you reassured by that? Is AUKUS still on as far as you know, Mr. Ambassador?
Well, for the benefit of folks here who are not familiar with AUKUS,
Yeah.
a 60-second summary.
Sure.
It's about 3 years old, an agreement between the United States and its two closest allies in the world, to be blunt, the United Kingdom and Australia. You know, we've been in the trenches with you guys in every war that you've been engaged in for the last 100 years.
The Canadians are already mad at us, so be careful here, because don't forget Canada.
We did not do 1812, okay? and the Brits and the Canadians may have burnt the White House, but we didn't.
Okay.
So anyway, apart from that minor historical excursion, going back to the core proposition, it's between your two closest allies. Secondly, what is it in substance? It's about Australia for the first time in the Indo-Pacific acquiring nuclear-powered conventionally armed submarines, SSNs, attack class submarines, which are highly lethal platforms, deeply respected and frankly feared by would-be adversaries in the Indo-Pacific. The first half of this proposed fleet of 8 or so boats would be acquired from the United States, Virginia-class vessels. The second part of the acquisition will be jointly built between the UK and Australia, called the SSN AUKUS class, and that would complete the formation of this new fleet during the course of the 2030s. The build program will be done in Adelaide in South Australia, making Adelaide one of only 4 places in the world which can therefore build a nuclear-powered submarine. Yes. And it's in the middle of the Indo-Pacific.
Hometown of the Murdoch family.
That's true.
The submarine probably won't be called the Rupert, though, I assume, right?
I'll leave that one right alone. But the second thing is, importantly for the United States,
yes.
In Western Australia, you'll have these boats based just south of Perth, right, together with
on the north side, yeah.
Visiting units of the United States SSN fleet, which turbocharges the Allied submarine capabilities in the Indian Ocean. That's where it changes the game, yes, as well as having a full fleet maintenance and repair facility in Perth, for which the United States would otherwise have to steam back to Hawaii, the West Coast, sure, or the East Coast. That essentially is what this arrangement is about. Yes. What the administration has announced most recently under Secretary Bridge Corby is an internal Pentagon review on the future of AUKUS. We're completely relaxed about that.
You are?
Yeah, because it is what administrations do when they're newly elected for programs which they've inherited from previous administrations. And we have had a series of on-the-record statements from Defence Secretary Hegseth, Secretary of State Rubio. You mentioned most recently the Starmer exchange with President Trump, not to mention the strong phalanx of support right across the Senate and the House, yes, Republicans and Democrats, who only a year or so ago had to vote to pass the AUKUS legislation to make this transfer of submarines possible. So we're relaxed about that. There's going to be an internal review. That is just normal. We would do the same thing if we were in the administration's shoes as well.
Let's talk about China some more. Obviously, our president and she had a conversation about 3 weeks ago. I believe it was initiated by President Trump, in which they both agreed to visit each other's countries this year. What do you think is the best case scenario for the U.S. and for our allies like Australia that can come from what appears to be this, I don't know if it's a warming, but at least a conversation is now happening between the two principals, and they apparently are going to meet?
Well, President Trump has met Xi Jinping more than most other leaders in the world. I mean, when I was Prime Minister of Australia, I spent time with Xi Jinping. We spoke quite a lot. and I've met him several times since. But frankly, if you did...
I think your Mandarin's better than President Trump's, though.
Yeah, but that's something... It was either that or become, you know, a pool shark as a kid, so I decided to learn Chinese instead. Took 5 years of my life, and it's been with me ever since. So that has helped, but to be frank, President Trump is in one-on-ones with, and in other engagements with President Xi, has spent more time with the Chinese president than I think any other leader, including President Biden, during his term in office and when he was Vice President of the United States. So they don't start from a cold start. Secondly, my understanding from the Chinese side is that President Xi is deeply respectful of any president of the United States, the commander-in-chief, but is deeply respectful of President Trump as well. And that is why, for example, these most recent trade negotiations, both in Geneva and London, were able to succeed in taking the temperature down in the bilateral trade war between the two of them. So what is the end point in terms of US-China relations? Yet to be carved out, yet to be determined. Finding a landing point on trade, finding a landing point on investment, a landing point on the future technology restrictions between the two countries, a landing point on core national security questions, including cyber and space, as well as narcotics and fentanyl. That's the work order. Can you reach an agreement on all of those? Arguably, yes. Will it be difficult? Demonstrably, yes. But, you know, there is something about President Trump's negotiating style which is so out of the box. Like, it's not conventional.
I've noticed that too.
It's not conventional, and therefore I think it behoves all of us in the international community not to reach any premature judgments about the impossibility of landing comprehensive agreements between the two countries. Something I certainly spend most of my time on in Washington is each element of that equation, and each element is hugely complex, and the Chinese, as you know, are formidable negotiators.
There may be nobody in the world who knows the answer to this question better than you, and there also may be nobody in the world who is as likely to dodge this question as you, but...
I agree with the second proposition.
Who needs this deal more, Washington or Beijing, Trump or Xi?
That's sort of a 6 or 7 part matrix that I ran through before. Vulnerability and or advantage differs between the two countries in each of those domains. There is no neat answer which covers all 7. There is a mutuality of interest in reaching a landing point which takes into account each side's national security interests, each side's core economic interests, as well as each country's future foreign policy interests, both in the Indo-Pacific and the rest of the world.
Right.
So therefore, there ain't a simple either or here. The fact that you have the two countries so significantly and substantially engaged now through 3 senior cabinet secretaries in the first 5 months of this administration means that the US takes it seriously. I know as an article of faith, knowing the Chinese system, as I do, having lived and worked in Beijing over many years, is that they certainly take these negotiations seriously because their core national interests are at stake as well. So I don't think we have an either or, one needs it more than the other. There is a mutuality of interest in landing this.
So that's a good non-answer, thank you.
No, it's because you want binary answers to a question which doesn't lend objectively a binary response.
Fair enough.
Life is not always binary, my friend.
You watched closely what happened with the trilateral agreement between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan in the previous administration, which at some point would have been hard to believe, seeing the Japanese and South Koreans working together like that. You understand how alarmed the Philippines are about the incursions in their waters from the Chinese. Do you think it's time for some kind of a NATO-like alliance in the Pacific between the U.S., Japan, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and such?
On the components of the strategic architecture of the Indo-Pacific, at present it hinges on 3 to 4 sets of arrangements. You have the bilateral security treaties with the Republic of Korea, Japan, Philippines, Thailand, people often forget, and Australia. There's 5 of them. Secondly, you have the Quad, which is not a mutual defence agreement, but it is increasingly a strategic cooperation platform, which is Japan, Australia, India, and the United States.
Yes.
Thirdly, you have the new forms of trilateral cooperation in the security domain between the ROK, Japan, Korea, Japan, and the United States. And I think the good news with the election of President Lee, the new president of South Korea, only a month ago, and having had the privilege to meet with him briefly myself with our Prime Minister when we were at the G7 in Canada, President Lee is making all sorts of quite remarkable efforts to sustain the collaboration with Japan in particular.
Yes.
And finally, part of this overall picture is AUKUS, which is the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom, which is out of theatre, but the United Kingdom regularly has units deployed within theatre as well. That's the existing strategic architecture. The question that you have to answer, if you said we need a Indo-Pacific NATO, is what is currently missing from those arrangements. Because against the benchmark, which is, has China so far been successfully deterred from taking Taiwan, the answer to that empirically is yes. And that is the product of 75 years of some, but not all of those arrangements that I've yet described. Furthermore, purely at the bilateral level, Australians at two-star level are totally integrated and embedded in the command structure of Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu right now, and have been for the last decade and a half.
So bottom line, the current architecture you think is sufficient in the Indo-Pacific?
It's always an evolving beast, which is, do we have the resources?
Yeah.
Where should they be placed? And what ultimately answers the core question is of maximising deterrence. And the answers to that will continue to change, but as of now, the arrangements have been working for the parties.
We're going to take questions here in a minute, but I want to ask about what is a favorite topic of people in this room, which is America. You know, the Americans like talking about America. Had you noticed that?
I've lived in your country now for 10 years, and I've noticed that.
Yeah. So you were Prime Minister.
But you know something? Back home in Australia, they talk about Australia. So this is not a unique American condition.
You were Prime Minister of Australia. You obviously spent a lot of time in the U.S. visiting here with former administration. You're now the ambassador in Washington, but you've traveled a good bit around the country as ambassador. Not just places like Aspen, but places like Knoxville, Tennessee, I know, as well. Just give us...
Are you from Knoxville, are you?
I'm not, but I understand the appeal of Rocky Top and all that in Knoxville. But just talk to the folks in here for a minute about your impressions of the U.S. now versus when you were Prime Minister. How has the country changed? Is it basically the same, or is there a difference now that you can sense in our country with the eyes of an outsider?
You remember Alistair Cook's letter to America?
The great British journalist, right?
Yeah. So I'm very reluctant to provide a contemporary Alistair Cook letter to America about the current state of America.
Well, don't be.
But what I've observed is the great commonality you share with our country, Australia, is the dynamism of your federation. You said I've spent a fair bit of time in Tennessee, for example. Whatever part of this country I go to, I'm always stunned by the dynamism of local economies and what is being done in parts of America which are rarely discussed in Washington, D.C. The Defence Industrial Base in Indiana. Silicon Valley everyone knows about. The explosion of AI and quantum in Seattle at the moment through the presences of AWS and Microsoft. The extraordinary growth of tech and new tech in southeastern America now, and that whole stretch from Texas through Tennessee down to Florida. That's quite remarkable. Bio is still not just alive and well, but booming out of Massachusetts and MIT.
Right,
And
the 128 corridor, right.
it's like your federation has, the founding fathers had a remarkable vision about this. When we sat down to federate ourselves in 1901, we looked at your constitution and said, yeah, we'll take that bit, thank you, we'll do a federation. We'll take the Senate, we actually have an Australian Senate which has identical powers and construction as your Senate. So, and by and large, the same applies in our country as well, a vast geography, a much smaller people than you do have, population, not people, than you guys have. But it is the dynamism of the federation which frankly I think continues to enliven the democracy. That's overall comment number one, which I see when I go around the country. I'm constantly knocked over by what's being done in parts of the country I had not heard of before. Number two observation, as someone who's spent the last 10 years living in the United States, running a think tank, being a scholar, and now...
the ambassador ran the China Society in New York before he was the ambassador.
So, Asia Society with
Asia Society, I'm sorry.
Center for China Analysis within it as well. So, but, you know, having come here for the first time a decade ago, and only the last 2 years being ambassador, your democracy, like ours, continues to be challenged by the whole question of the affordability of life and the unfolding challenges of work given the avalanche of artificial intelligence which is about to hit the workplace. These dynamics roil both of our democracies because it's a question of what you call the American dream, we call the Australian dream. And the Australian dream, part of our political vocabulary in Australia, is that every person who goes to work should have the ability to own their own home and to raise a family. That's kind of what we think. You have different dimensions to the American dream, go out and start your own business and all the rest of it, and that's great. But at the point at which any of our democracies, yours, ours, the Brits, whomever, become challenged at a fundamental level about can we continue to provide adequate equality of opportunity and for everyone to have a purchase point into the dream, that is why we see where we see the fracture points emerging in our various political democracies, and we are no strangers to that in Australia.
Is there any better place to be a China hand right now than Washington, D.C.?
Well,
besides Beijing?
In Beijing, it's, like I've lived and worked in Beijing, I know the Chinese system pretty well. It's a pretty tight old group there. And, you know, short of, you know, a couple of bottles of Mount Hai, you don't quite get to the core blunt and brutal conversations that need to be had behind closed doors. I've had a number of those over the years. The great thing about Washington, D.C., whether it's a Democrat administration or a Republican administration, such as the current administration, is there is, for close allies and partners, genuinely an open door if you're able to bring an idea to the table which is useful and deliverable in terms of the future of US-China relations. Why do we, as allies and partners, have a core interest in this? If we land US-China relations effectively for the rest of this century, the peace of the planet and the peace of the Indo-Pacific is assured. And if we fail, then the reverse consequences, not just in terms of strategic stability, but a torpedo amidships to the global economy, if there was crisis, conflict and war between the world's two largest economies and militaries, would frankly be beyond imagining of anything we've seen since 1945.
On that sobering note, let's take some questions. Yes, right here. In the front.
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating discourse. My name is Dustin Ross, and I run Sunflower Network, which is an organization building hospitals in Ukraine. I also speak Chinese. My plan was to build a career at the intersection of US and Chinese economic relations. Unfortunately, the world had different ideas, and that seemed to be not a great hypothesis. But I feel as though so much of the discourse we see in our society is around the how of US-China competition. What happens if China invades Taiwan? Can you opine a little bit on the why? What are the actual first principles at play? You talked a little bit about China, but from a US perspective, what are the strategic interests and how do those evolve over time said differently, does the U.S. calculus for defending Taiwan change as time goes on?
Well, thank you for the work you're doing with Ukraine. Passing note, we are also global citizens in Australia. We're their largest non-NATO contributor of military kit and equipment because we think the Ukrainians have been dealt a really bad hand and we should all help. Anyway.
You're here.
On the core question, though, you ask, which is the ultimate, shall we say, strategic objectives of both these great powers, the United States and China. For China, as I have spent a lot of time reading Xi Jinping's internal party literature, it is quite plain that China's objective is, in the course of this century, and if they can pull it off in the course of the next quarter century, to become the predominant military and economic and technological power in the world. I don't have to invent that, it's there in their literature. So their diplomacy and their national security policy and their economic and industrial policy and their technology policy are instruments towards that end. A secondary objective from that is to then, through Chinese leadership, shape a new international order which is more accommodating of China's, and therefore the Chinese Communist Party's, interests and values. That would be radically different to the order that we collectively constructed after the destruction of the Second World War, through the San Francisco Conference, the UN, the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, the bank and the fund, and the creation of all the bilateral and multilateral security alliances around the world since then, largely from the Truman administration on. 46 treaty partners around the world. That's the current infrastructure, which underpins the current, what we call, liberal international rules-based order. Not perfect, but it's one which has served the world not badly over the decades, and particularly since the strategy the United States employed against the Soviet Union succeeded with the implosion of the Soviet Union in 1991. So what the Chinese are doing is saying they see themselves as the ascendant power, they see the United States as a declining power, and once they see that transition as having occurred, to leverage that power to create a new international rules-based system of their own. What do we say as democracies about that, and as friends, partners and allies of the United States, is we don't support that. Despite all the imperfections of United States foreign policy and security policy over the decades, we could have multiple seminars about that, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc. The bottom line is, this order which has been constructed through American leadership in Europe and in the rest of the world, based on principles of open societies, open economies, and open political systems, is one that we as democracies subscribe to. So if you want to know what the ideational and therefore objective basis for a different worldview is between these two systems, in a nutshell, it's that. And that's why it's fairly binary. And that's why deterrence is important as part of the equation. But if we get through deterrence and we maintain strategic stability, to manage the strategic competition between the United States and China in a manner which recognises national security interests, recognises economic competition, understands there still needs to be space for areas of global cooperation, whether it's on pandemics or in global diseases and the rest, and climate action, but doing that without blowing each other's brains out. But that has to be anchored in deterrence.
Who else? Yes, sir, in the blue, right there. Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you. And I asked this question duly humbled by your comment earlier that not everything is binary. But for those of us who haven't been studying China for 50 years, but we read occasionally, even as Americans, and we read, on one hand, China can't afford a war, it's an export-driven economy, and it can't afford a disruption to the order that you're talking about. And on the other hand, we read military expenditures committed to a hegemony and maybe beyond just the motherland. Is it silly for us to think it's going to go in one way or the other, or do you have a view of that? Do they continue to reconcile them? What happens?
No, you're right to ask the question, because if as a layperson, you're looking at all this going on, you'd say, what does all this mean? Because it seems to be heading in multiple different directions at once. And China itself is not monochrome. It is not simply a single unitary view. There are multiple views within the People's Republic. There are multiple views within the Chinese Communist Party. So, the way in which we try and see it is in these terms. We cannot, as responsible nation states, ignore what we observe empirically and through intelligence about changes in the size, composition and disposition of Chinese military assets in the Indo-Pacific and around the world. We cannot ignore what China is now doing in cyber and space. We cannot ignore what China is doing in terms of the applications of artificial intelligence to weapon systems and the emergence of various forms of robotic warfare. We can't put all that to one side. Nor can we put to one side the fact that China represents an enormous engine room of the global economy, that a lot of the predominant part of global economic growth for the last quarter of a century has come off the back of China's own successful application of its domestic growth model. Nor can we put to one side the fact that China, as a great power and a great civilization, has a legitimate place in the world. China is all these things at once. Okay, but what I know as a China scholar is that it is led by the Chinese Communist Party, it is led by Xi Jinping, and our responsibility is to understand that Xi Jinping has a hierarchy of priorities of the type I described before and operates within that. It doesn't mean that we are therefore incapable of engaging China along those lines, but it has to be always done with a lens of strategic realism, which is why I keep going back to the fundamentals of the deterrence equation on the military. If that is secure, all other forms of engagement with China are possible, but we cannot simply push that uncomfortable part to one side. Otherwise, we're doing a disservice to the next generation.
Let's do one more question, and then we're going to wrap. Anybody? Yeah, yellow shirt. Yep.
Thoughts on the militarization? Oh, excuse me. And again, like everyone has said, it's been an amazing talk. What are your thoughts on the militarization of Japan? You had said deterrence is an important piece of the puzzle.
Well, Japan, as you know from its history, and particularly the post-Second World War Constitution, General MacArthur's role in the shaping of the political infrastructure of Japan in the period of 45, 49, created a series of institutional arrangements around one core proposition. If there was ever to be any future military, it would be constitutionally constrained to be a self-defense force and would have no offensive capabilities at all. We all know the reasons why. My father was a serviceman in the Pacific War with American soldiers fighting the good fight, and we prevailed. So I do not have an absence of historical memory on this at all. I've listened to too many stories and I've read too much history of the period. However, Japan, since '54, being a treaty ally of the United States, over the decades has concluded itself, and with the encouragement of the United States, really from the 1990s on, that it had to become more forward-leaning in its capabilities to effectively defend the Japanese archipelago, which is vast when you see the extent of the island chain proceeding south towards Taiwan. And what you have seen, therefore, is the evolution of Japanese capabilities along those lines. And the uptick in the Japanese defense expenditure to now 2% of GDP from historical levels less than 1% of GDP, for a country which is now still the fourth largest economy in the world, perhaps the third, is consequential in our region and welcomed by the US, welcomed by US allies in the region, including our friends in the Philippines, as contributing to collective deterrence.
Kevin Rudd, politician, diplomat, China hand, fan of America. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.